I came home from my mother's memorial service, still wearing the black dress I'd buried her in 6 days earlier, to find a bulldozer parked where her rose garden used to be, 43 rose bushes she had planted and tended over 11 years, reduced to churned dirt and a scattering of torn root balls, with two men in orange vests laying gravel for what a freshly staked sign identified as Visitor Parking, Section C. My name is Farah de Lacroix. My mother, Coretta, lived in the house next to mine in Willowmere Estates for the last 11 years of her life, in a small casita my husband Bartholomew and I had built specifically so she could be close to us as she aged. And in that time, she had built, along the side yard of that casita, one of the most genuinely beautiful rose gardens I have ever seen outside a professional botanical display. A project she poured herself into with a dedication that, looking back now, I think was as much about grief for my father, who she'd lost 8 years before her own death, as it was about the roses themselves. I want to tell you about my mother's final months, because I think it matters for understanding the specific cruelty of what happened. Coretta was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer about 5 months before she passed, and during that time, even as her strength declined, she insisted on being wheeled out to that garden nearly every day that weather allowed, sitting among the roses she'd planted, telling me stories about which varieties she'd chosen and why, which ones had struggled and which had thrived, in a way that I understood even then was her own quiet way of saying goodbye to something she loved. She passed on a Tuesday morning in early spring, with the garden already beginning its seasonal bloom outside her window, and I want to tell you that in the 6 days between her death and her memorial service, consumed as we were with funeral arrangements, notifying family, the exhausting logistics of grief, I did not think once about that garden's future, because it had never occurred to me that anything would happen to it at all. The woman responsible for what happened is named Priscilla Wentworth Ashby, president of the Willowmere Estates Board for just over 2 years by that point. I want to walk you through what I later learned about her thinking, because it reveals something important about how casually this decision was apparently made. According to what I pieced together afterward, Priscilla had, for several months prior to my mother's death, been fielding informal complaints from a small group of residents about inadequate visitor parking near a cluster of homes on our section of the development, and had apparently identified the side yard beside my mother's casita, land that had always simply looked, to anyone driving past, like an extension of our own property, as a convenient solution. What Priscilla apparently did not do, at any point before authorizing that bulldozer, was verify who actually owned that land. I came home from the memorial service that afternoon in a state that I can only describe, even now, as a kind of suspended shock, and I want to tell you, standing on my own driveway staring at what remained of my mother's garden, I did not initially even process what I was looking at as deliberate. My first thought, absurdly, was that this had to be some kind of mistake, a contractor who'd gotten the wrong address, some catastrophic miscommunication that would resolve itself the moment anyone realized what had actually happened. It was not a mistake. A violation notice, dated that same morning, was taped to my own front door, informing me that the unauthorized landscaping encroachment, on what the notice described as HOA common area adjacent to Lot 47, had been removed pursuant to the board's authority to maintain community common spaces, and that a new visitor parking area was being installed to address long-standing community parking needs. I want to tell you about the specific quality of the anger and grief that moved through me reading that notice, because I don't think I have adequate words for it even now. This was not simply a property dispute. This was 6 days after burying my mother, standing in the wreckage of the last place she had chosen to spend her final months, being told, in the clinical language of an HOA violation notice, that her garden had been an unauthorized encroachment. I called Bartholomew, who was still at the house helping our children process the day, and I remember my own voice sounding strange to me on that call, flat and distant in a way that worried him enough that he came outside immediately. Together we stood in what remained of that garden, and it was Bartholomew, understanding immediately that I was in no state to handle what needed to happen next, who made the first call to my cousin Desmond Okonkwo, a real estate attorney who had helped us with the original paperwork when we built Coretta's casita 11 years earlier. I want to walk you through what Desmond found over the following week, because it turned out to matter enormously, and because I think, honestly, grief made it difficult for me to focus on much of anything beyond simply getting through each day during that period, which made Desmond's involvement and his willingness to handle the actual investigative work while I focused on simply surviving those first raw weeks, something I remain deeply grateful for even now. Desmond's first move was pulling the original property survey and deed records from when we'd built the casita, documents he still had on file from handling that original transaction. What those records showed, clearly and unambiguously, was that the side yard where my mother's garden had stood was not, and had never been, HOA common area at all. It was part of our own lot, Lot 46, not Lot 47, as the violation notice had described, a distinction that turned out to be the entire crux of what had happened. I want to explain the confusion, as Desmond eventually reconstructed it, because it reveals a level of carelessness on Priscilla's part that still, honestly, makes me angry to think about even now. Lot 47, the neighboring property on the other side, did include a small strip of genuine HOA common area along its edge, land that had, at various points over the community's history, been informally used for overflow parking during larger community events. Priscilla, apparently working from an outdated or simply incorrectly labeled community plat map, had confused the boundary between Lot 46, our own private property, and Lot 47's actual common area strip, authorizing the bulldozer to clear what she believed was community land, but what was, in reality, land we had owned outright for over a decade. Desmond confirmed this beyond any doubt by pulling the original recorded plat from the county, filed when the development was first built, cross-referencing it against our specific deed, and finding that the boundary line was not even particularly ambiguous once you looked at the actual survey markers, meaning this was not some genuinely confusing edge case that any reasonable person might have gotten wrong. It was, in Desmond's professional assessment, a mistake that could and should have been caught with about 15 minutes of basic due diligence before any bulldozer was ever authorized to touch that land. Farah, Desmond told me, sitting with me at my kitchen table with the deed and survey spread out between us, I want you to understand exactly what this means. She didn't just violate an HOA policy or overreach on some ambiguous interpretation of shared authority. She authorized the destruction of privately owned property that belonged entirely to you, using equipment and labor the HOA paid for, based on a factual error about who owned the land that a basic records check would have immediately corrected. This isn't a landscaping dispute. This is trespass and destruction of private property, and given the timing, given what that garden actually was, I think any court is going to take this considerably more seriously than an ordinary property line disagreement. I want to tell you about the moment this shifted, for me, from a fog of grief-numbed disbelief into something with real, focused direction, because it happened almost immediately once Desmond laid out exactly what the deed and survey actually showed. Sitting at that table, looking at documentation that proved, beyond any argument Priscilla could possibly offer, that she had bulldozed land she had never had any authority over in the first place, I felt something in me that had been simply absorbing blow after blow for 6 days finally turn into something closer to resolve. What Desmond and I did not yet know, sitting at that kitchen table with the deed spread out between us, was that this was not actually the first time Priscilla had made exactly this kind of boundary error, and that the pattern behind it, once we started digging into her prior tenure on the board, revealed something considerably more troubling than simple carelessness, something that would end up mattering enormously for how this entire situation was finally resolved. The pattern Desmond uncovered went back nearly 3 years, to the very beginning of Priscilla's board tenure, and it took him the better part of 2 weeks, cross-referencing old community meeting minutes against county property records, to piece together fully. Twice before, in disputes that had never escalated to litigation because the affected homeowners had simply complied rather than fight, Priscilla had authorized HOA action, In one case, a fence relocation. In another, a tree removal, based on the same kind of boundary confusion between actual HOA common areas and adjacent private lots. Using what Desmond eventually determined was an outdated community plat map that had never been properly updated following a minor boundary adjustment made during the development's original construction phase, nearly 15 years earlier. Both prior homeowners, once Desmond reached out to them directly, expressed a similar mixture of relief and frustration upon learning that what had happened to them years earlier had, in fact, been just as unauthorized as what had now happened to me. Relief at finally understanding they'd been right to feel something was wrong. Frustration that neither had pursued it further at the time, assuming, as I nearly had myself in that first foggy day of shock, that the HOA's confident assertion of authority must have some legitimate basis they simply didn't understand. "This is the part that matters most for your case," Desmond told me once he'd finished compiling the full pattern. "This isn't a one-time, understandable mistake. This is a board president who has, for years, been relying on an outdated map rather than actual current property records before authorizing destructive action on land she doesn't fully understand the boundaries of. That's not just carelessness. Depending on how a judge views it, that could reasonably be characterized as a reckless disregard for property rights that she had every opportunity and obligation to verify properly before ever picking up a phone to schedule a bulldozer." Desmond filed a formal legal complaint on my behalf within 3 weeks of the incident, seeking damages for the destroyed garden, valued through an independent horticultural assessment that accounted not just for the mature rose bushes themselves, but for the 11 years of established root systems and soil cultivation that would take considerably longer than a simple replanting to restore to anything resembling their original condition. Along with damages for trespass and what Desmond argued constituted reckless destruction of property given the demonstrated pattern of prior similar incidents. I want to walk you through the emotional weight of the discovery process that followed, because it required me, in the middle of active grief, to sit through depositions describing in detail exactly what that garden had meant, testimony that Bartholomew later told me was some of the hardest things he'd ever watched me do, describing my mother's final months, the hours she'd spent among those roses, the specific meaning behind certain varieties she'd chosen. All of it entered into a formal legal record because a woman hadn't bothered to check a deed before authorizing its destruction. Priscilla's defense, once her own attorney became involved, attempted to characterize the incident as a genuine, good-faith mistake based on reasonable reliance on the community's existing plat map, an argument that Desmond dismantled fairly directly once the pattern of 2 prior similar incidents became part of the discovery record. Since a genuine one-time error looks considerably different from a documented pattern of failing to verify property boundaries before authorizing destructive HOA action, particularly once it became clear that the outdated map Priscilla claimed to have relied on had, in fact, been superseded by an updated, accurate community plat filed with the county nearly 6 years earlier, a document that was, per county record-keeping requirements, publicly available and easily accessible to anyone who simply bothered to request it, which meant Priscilla's continued use of the outdated version represented not an unavoidable error, but a specific, repeated failure to use readily available, accurate information. I want to tell you about the moment I felt something shift back toward my mother's memory rather than simply the fight over what had happened to her garden, because it happened during a mediation session Desmond and Priscilla's attorney arranged about 4 months into the litigation, an attempt to settle before the case proceeded to a full trial. Sitting across from Priscilla in that mediation room, the first time I had seen her directly since the incident itself, I watched her attempt, several times, to offer what she seemed to intend as an apology, though each attempt came wrapped in enough procedural qualification. I understand this was clearly upsetting, though the board's intent was never to cause harm, that it never quite landed as genuine remorse so much as careful legal positioning. It was Desmond, near the end of that session, who said something that I think finally broke through whatever defensive posture Priscilla had maintained throughout. He said simply, "She buried her mother 6 days before your bulldozer arrived. The garden was the last place her mother chose to spend her final months." I don't think you need a lawyer in the room to understand why an apology that leads with the board's intent, rather than genuine acknowledgement of what was actually lost, isn't going to mean very much to her. The mediation resulted in a settlement shortly after that exchange, one that included full compensation for the garden's value as independently assessed, damages reflecting the emotional distress caused by the timing and circumstances, and critically, a formal commitment from the HOA to conduct a complete, professionally surveyed update of the community's plat records, cross-referenced against actual county deeds for every property. Specifically to prevent this exact kind of boundary confusion from ever affecting another homeowner going forward, a provision Desmond had pushed hard for, understanding, correctly, that money alone wouldn't feel like enough of a resolution without some assurance that the underlying carelessness that caused this wouldn't simply repeat itself against someone else's garden, someone else's fence, someone else's tree. Priscilla resigned from the board within weeks of the settlement, and the community, once the full pattern became known through the mediation record shared at a subsequent board meeting, passed a formal policy requiring any HOA action affecting land near a property boundary to be verified against current, professionally surveyed records before any physical work could be authorized. A policy that several longtime residents told me afterward they wished had simply existed as common sense from the very beginning. I want to tell you about what we did with that settlement, because it matters more to me than any of the legal resolution itself. Bartholomew and I used a significant portion of it to fully restore the garden, working with a landscape designer who specialized in memorial gardens, someone who spent considerable time with me discussing my mother's specific rose varieties, her particular arrangement choices, the small bench she used to sit on among them during her final months, recreating as much of the original design as possible while adding a small new element, a modest stone marker at the garden's center. Engraved simply with her name and the dates of her life, something the original garden, built while she was still alive and tending it herself, had never needed, but that felt, once the garden was rebuilt in her honor rather than her active presence, like the right way to mark what it had become. I want to tell you about the day the roses bloomed again, nearly 14 months after the bulldozer first tore through that soil, because I remember standing in that garden with Bartholomew and our children, the stone marker catching the afternoon light, the same varieties my mother had chosen 11 years earlier now growing again in soil that had been carefully restored and replanted, and feeling something that was not quite closure, because I don't think grief resolves into something as clean as closure, but something close to a kind of peace, knowing that the last place she chose to spend her final months existed again, protected now not just by love, but by a legal record establishing, permanently, exactly whose land it had always been. If there's a lesson in this story, I think it's something Desmond said to me during one of our early meetings, sitting at my kitchen table reviewing the original deed for what felt like the 10th time. He said that HOA boards, particularly ones that have operated for years, without anyone seriously challenging their assumed authority, sometimes stop distinguishing between land they actually have jurisdiction over and land they simply assume falls under their control, a habit of authority that grows unchecked specifically because most homeowners, faced with confident institutional assertion, don't think to ask for the actual paperwork proving it. He said the moment you do ask, the moment you pull the deed and the survey and simply look at what the documents actually say rather than what anyone claims they say, that assumed authority tends to evaporate considerably faster than anyone defending it ever expects. We asked, and it turns out that one old deed, filed away for 11 years since we first built my mother's casita, one accurate county plat that had been sitting publicly available the entire time, and one cousin willing to do the careful, patient work of proving it while I focused on simply surviving the worst week of my life, were more than enough to make sure my mother's roses came home, exactly where they had always belonged, on land that had never, for one single day, been anyone's to bulldoze but ours. Thumbnail text. She bulldozed my mom's garden.